So today we're going to be having a look at Class 6, our toxic, and Class 8, our corrosive substances, and find out why there seems to be renewed interest in them. We'll start by looking at what these substances or hazards are, or what substances fall into these categories, and why are we interested in them now specifically. We'll then have a look at the controls and the regulations that apply to these substances. So what are Class 6 and Class 8 toxic substances? When we think of toxic substances, we usually tend to think of the acutely toxic substances, the ones that will kill you quick, or more specifically, the ones that show their toxic effect at the time of or shortly after exposure to them. They are classified based on their LD50, their fatal dose, and they range from 6.1A, deadly poisons like cyanide, and at the bottom of the scale, something like table salt, which is classified as a class 6.1E. If you eat enough salt, it will be fatal, but it will also make you sick if you manage to keep it all down. Class 6 toxic substances also encompass things that impact on your quality of life, either short-term or long-term, and the effects may also be fatal from these as well. So we've got skin irritants and eye irritants, so things that are going to cause short-term discomfort, but that short-term could be a matter of days or weeks. Sensitizers, products that can cause an allergic type reaction, so something like asthma or dermatitis. And we've got some of the more long-term effects, so mutagens, carcinogens, reproductive toxicity, and also things that impact on a particular target organ or system, so like kidney damage, or that might affect the nervous system, those sorts of substances. For Class 8, looking at corrosives, we consider whether they will cause damage to metals, which is important for transport and storage perspectives, and as well as how quickly and intensely they will cause permanent damage to your skin and your eyes. And as you can imagine, and you may have experienced, that damage is painful and can be permanent. Really want to avoid those. If by some chance these classifications are new to you, or you easily confuse your 6.3s and your 6.6s, the upcoming change to the GHS, the globally harmonised system, may be good news for you. So without going into the background of it, the new classification regime is coming towards the end of April next year and will align our classifications with our international trading partners. And as much as I love our classifications codes, they're really good shorthand. I'm slowly coming to realise that for people who don't deal with them on a day-to-day basis, having the classification spelled out in words may be useful. So we'll move from a situation where we refer to a 6.1C substance, and we'll actually refer to it as something with an acute dermal toxicity category 3, so that we know that it's acute toxicity, it is toxic through the skin, and it's category 3 on the 1 to 4 or 5 scale there. So this is coming through, and there'll be more information coming out when we get that as to how that's all going to be implemented. There's a huge range of substances that do have toxic or corrosive properties, from our household products to deadly poisons and major industrial chemicals. For the purposes of the regulations, they can be grouped into industrial or laboratory chemicals, and also the products that are designed to kill or otherwise control pests in some way or another, like our agrochemicals, our fumigants, our vertebrate toxic agents. And here's just a very small example. We can't forget that substances don't usually fit into one nice simple hazard classification. So all of the flammable and oxidizing substances that you deal with are likely to have a toxic or corrosive property as well. So kerosene, harmful to the skin, has some long-term toxic effects as well. Hydrogen peroxide there is corrosive as well as oxidizing. So most substances that you deal with will have multiple classifications. Most likely they'll have multiple class 6 classifications, and if they're corrosive, then they're likely to be corrosive to the skin, eyes, and to metal as well. So why is there seem to be an interest all of a sudden in toxic and corrosive substances from a regulatory perspective? There have always been regulations that relate to the toxic and corrosive substances. There was pre-HSNO, there were toxic substances regulations. Under HSNO, we had our class 6, 8, 9 control regulations. And in the new regulations in 2017, we saw for the first time certification requirements for the storage of certain class 6 and 8 substances. And these requirements came into force at the end of last year, December 2019, and have caused not a small amount of debate and concern about how these can be practically implemented. So this is why there seems to be a bit of a resurgence or a bit of a strong interest in the controls or the requirements for toxic and corrosive substances. When we're looking at the regulations that apply to the substances, we can group them into sort of 3 main groups. So the ones that are of most interest from the perspective of the change or the new rules, what I sometimes call the famous 5. So we're looking at class 6.1 A, B and C, our deadly poisons, and 8.2 A and B, the ones that are the most skin corrosive. These are the ones that this new certification requirements apply to. Then we've got all the other class 6 and other class 8 classifications that do have some controls on them. So we'll have a look at the controls that apply across the board to all of our class 6 and 8 substances. They're mostly found in part 13 of the regulations. But before we head there, don't forget that the general requirements, or there are requirements that apply to all substances. So you will need an inventory of your hazardous substances, including safety data sheets. Everyone who works with hazardous substances needs to be trained and be supervised until they're competent, and you need to make sure that you've got records of that training and competence. The products need to be labelled and packaged, and that labelling and packaging needs to remain in good condition. If you've got larger quantities, then you will need signage and emergency response plans. And the risk management principles apply, particularly where there's hazards that might not be fully managed by the regulations explicitly. So we need to make sure that we consider all aspects of our controls, looking at the class 6 and 8s. There are a range of controls for specific situations or products that I'm not going to be looking into today, but they may apply to you. So if you're using pesticides, if you've got some 1080, vertebrate toxic agents, fumigants and transport of the toxic and corrosive substances, there are some specific controls around there. So getting into some of the more nitty-gritty. Any equipment that you use for handling your toxic substances or your corrosives need to contain and dispense in a controlled manner. And there needs to be documentation on the use and maintenance of that equipment. Clearly, this will depend on what you're actually doing. So if you've got a container and you're pouring it into a jug or using a funnel, then that's quite different to where you might have a fully automated control system. So making sure that the level of information is commensurate with what you're actually doing and the type of equipment that you're using. As you should all be aware, PPE is the last thing that should be considered as a control measure. So when you're applying the hierarchy of controls to your hazards, we look to see if we can eliminate the hazard, and then if we can minimize it by substitution, isolation, preventing contact, and engineering controls, and then look at administrative controls, and then if any risk still remains, we would look at personal protective equipment, PPE. So under the hazardous substance regulations, PPE is required as a minimising control for all toxic and corrosive substances, or most of them. There's a few of the minor hazards, so if it's 6.1E, if it's mildly skin irritating, if it's eye irritating, if it's metal corrosive, then PPEs not required by these regulations. The general risk and workplace management regulations do apply as well when you're looking at your PPE. You do need to make sure that you know that you have selected the correct type of PPE, both for the substances that you're using and the exposure scenarios that apply. And if it's complicated, or particularly with inhalation hazards, you may need the input of an occupational hygienist there. You should be able to show with confidence that the PPE that you're using is appropriate for your situation. You also need to make sure that workers know how to correctly use and maintain any PPE that they're given. So again, looking at respiratory PPE, that you've got a good program in place for fit testing, for changing filters and maintenance of those. Certified handlers are required for class 6.1 A and B substances, as well as for any substance that requires a controlled substance license. So this used to be called an approved handler, and under the change in the regulations, certified handlers are required for a lesser range of substances than an approved handler needed in the past, and that's mitigated by that requirement for worker training for everyone using hazardous substances. So now we're looking at the most hazardous, the most toxic substances where a certified handler is needed, and those substances must either be under the personal control of the certified handler or be locked away so that no one can access them. People who are not a certified handler can handle those substances. If the certified handler is present where it's being handled, they've provided guidance and they're available at all times to provide assistance. A controlled substance license is required for the possession of specified substances. So for the 6.1 A and B vertebrate toxic agents, VTAs, and also for anything that's specified in Schedule 13. So there's a range of specific products there as well. So a certified handler is required for handling substances, and the controlled substance license is required for possession of a substance. And having a certified handler certificate is a prerequisite for a controlled substance license. In addition, some substances are required to be secured if left unattended. And this is slightly different from the requirement for stores or your storage places to be secured from access by unauthorised people. So if you've got 6.1C substances, if you've got more than 10 litres of carcinogens, and also if you've got some of these very highly corrosive 8.2A substances, then those need to be locked away as well, or be able to be locked away if left unattended. Very few substances are 8.2A, and just as a side note, it is something that we're finding a wee bit of confusion about when people are looking at the GHS hazard statement that goes with corrosives. It doesn't distinguish between the 8.2A, B and C, so we do find substances that people think are 8.2A but are actually not that highly corrosive. They're really quite nasty, those ones. If we're looking at our toxic substances, then one of the things that we want to prevent is exposure to those. And so there are a range of exposure limits or exposure standards in place to help prevent risk from exposure to toxic substances. So a tolerable exposure limit, a TEL, is designed to protect the public. So they are concentrations that shouldn't be exceeded in air or water, and they're typically set for pesticides and fumigants. And there's a few other substances that have those, but not a huge number. A prescribed exposure standard is something that we need to make sure that is not exceeded. It's highly mandated, but there's only been a couple that have been explicitly set, so around 1080 and methyl bromide. They are designed to protect workers. The workplace exposure standards, or the WES that you may be familiar with, and these cover hundreds of substances, are not prescribed exposure standards for the purposes of the regulations, but control and monitoring is still required under the General Risk and Workplace Management regulations, and also as part of our risk management to ensure that the health risks from worker exposure are being adequately controlled. So while it's not mandated explicitly that you need to do monitoring for the WES, it does come through as part of the risk management requirements there. And so if you're unsure about what your exposure to particularly airborne contaminants is, then that's where an occupational hygienist will come into play to help you quantify and mitigate that. Secondary containment is all about containing substances should the primary containment fail. So we've got primary, secondary and tertiary containment. If our package or tank fails, we want it to be contained fairly closely with the secondary containment. So our buns and trays and things in place there. There are thresholds for those, and they're relatively high depending on the class. So for the most toxic, the highly corrosive substance, that's 100 litres, and then for some of the lesser, well, not necessarily, they are lesser hazards. If you had more than 10,000 litres, then you would need containment. Secondary containment is best practice anyway, and we see scattered throughout the Part 13 requirements that there is control for spillage is required, so that comes in at a lower threshold. Your local council plans may also have something to say on the containment capacity of secondary containment. The purpose of this is to protect people and to prevent contamination, or your secondary containment system needs to protect people and prevent contamination of the substances. So we need to be able to clean it up efficiently and not have reactions occur. The capacity required for those depends on the container size, and assuming that there's not a class 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5 classes associated with our toxic or corrosive substances, it's not necessarily a huge proportion. So either 110% of your largest container, or certainly when you get to really large quantities, we're looking at 5% of our total pooling potential. So we need to look at the total volume of hazardous substances and make sure that we can contain a certain fraction of that. And speaking of spills and containments, the last section, or last slide in this section, is if you've got any of my famous 5, the 6.1 ABCs and your 8.2 A's and B's, then you do need to have equipment and materials so that you can deal with any leaks or spills, and that's whether major or minor. So any spillage that occurs, you need to have the equipment and the materials on hand to be able to deal with those efficiently and quickly, and if required, or if appropriate, any neutralising or decontaminating chemicals or products that you might need, so that if you've had a spill of an acid product, you can collect it up and then you can neutralise that, so that you don't have residual harm there. So there's no threshold for that, but if you do have those classes of substances, make sure that you've got those precautions in place. And I'd like to think that you would have suitable equipment for dealing with the likely spills, no matter what class of substance you've got, or even if if someone spills a bucket of cleaning water, you'd want to make sure that you could clean that up so you don't have a prolonged slip hazard. Okay, moving on to a drink of water. Storage not at a hazardous substance location. So we're moving on to the section of the regulations that's dealing with our famous 5 substances, and we're going to look at these not at a hazardous substance location. And in a bit of a backwards way, I'll look at what a hazardous substance location is shortly. But if you don't need one for reason of the quantity or the nature of your use of your substances, then these are the regulations that apply. So we need to make sure that the place, or our storage place, can be secured secured from unauthorised access. So if the PCBU was happy for someone to be there, then they'll need to make sure that they've got the appropriate training. Otherwise, you want to make sure that you can exclude people. You need to make sure that you've got a supply of water available nearby for personal hygiene, so washing your hands, for example. That adequate ventilation is provided for all storage and handling areas. Adequate is not defined here, but you would take into account the workplace exposure standards, for example, or if things are only in closed packages, then an inhalation risk is unlikely. We need to make sure that our substances are not kept near hazardous substances which they are incompatible with, or which they might react dangerously with, and I'm going to go into this in more detail shortly. We also need to make sure that they're kept away from sources of heat, are securely closed, and are kept in a way that would avoid spillage. And then we also need to have appropriate spill retention measures in place, so that if you are opening containers or decanting, then any spill is able to be contained, and then we can use our equipment and neutralising materials to get that all cleaned up. So we'll have a look at the incompatibles and what reacts dangerously. So the regulations specify or define what is incompatible with these classes of substances for the purposes of this regulation. So our toxic substances are incompatible with explosives or oxidizers, so keep these stored separately. And if you had any toxic cyanides, we want to make sure those are kept well away from acids. Acids and cyanides will react to create hydrogen cyanide, poisonous gas. We want to keep our corrosives away from explosives, things that are dangerous when wet. If something's going to react with water, then it's highly likely to react much more intensely with an acid or an alkali. And again, oxidizers need to be kept away. Keep our acids away from cyanides, and also keep our acids and our alkalis separate. So it's really good to see this. Unfortunately, the classification regime and even the dangerous goods classifications that you see for transport, those classes don't clearly identify what is acid and alkali. So if it's not something that you're familiar with or is obvious from the name, then you'd need to look at the safety data sheet and see what the pH is to give you a better indication of those. The regulations don't define what they mean by react dangerously, but it is defined in the Australian and New Zealand standards for the storage of toxic substances and the one for corrosive substances. And these standards are invoked as a means of segregation in the regulation. So this is why we bring the definition in from the standards there. So something reacts dangerously if the reaction is violent, if it produces an explosion or a potentially explosive situation, if it produces fire or rapid generation of heat, or if it produces a toxic vapor or gas. So cyanides and acids give us a toxic vapor or gas. And if you've ever mixed acids and alkalis together, that neutralization reaction generates a lot of heat. One of the things that you learn in chemistry, or certainly that I learned in school, is do what you ought to, add acid to water, because of the heat that is generated when acids either react with water or with alkalides. The other common example there that features heavily in some industries is acids and hypochlorite. So if you've got a hypochlorite or a bleach-based sanitizer, that needs to be kept away from acids because they react to produce chlorine gas. If you happen to be on a farm, then there are some slightly different provisions that apply, and it's really about keeping your toxic and corrosive substances away from protected places, away from the boundary, away from combustible materials, and that you control any spills. Right. Now we'll have a look at what actually is a hazardous substance location. So we've determined what we need to do. If we don't have one, let's find out if we actually do have a hazardous substance location. So the first step is the thresholds. So the thresholds for each of the classes are shown here. So 50 or 250, 1,000 kilograms, depending on the class there. You do apply a ratio calculation if you've got multiple classes held together. So if you had 40 kilograms of a 6.1A, you would count that as being 80% towards your ratio or your threshold. And then if you had another 500 kilograms of a 6.1C, that would bring us over 100%. We'd exceed the threshold, even though the individual ones don't. If you've got substances that are incompatible and stored separately, then you wouldn't count those together on that same calculation. The thresholds only apply to solids or liquids, so toxic and corrosive gases are not included in the thresholds for needing a hazardous substance location. And the most common examples of our toxic or corrosive gases are also flammable or oxidizing, so ammonia, methyl bromide, chlorine gas, for example. So there are already some location certification controls based on those properties. And there are different thresholds for farms, and there's also some slightly different wording in the regulations around those thresholds, which really appeals to my geeky side, but I'm not going to subject you to my thoughts on that at this point. If you are a farm, do have a read of them. The other aspect about whether or not you're at a hazardous substance location, so if you exceed the threshold, we then need to establish whether you're in storage or not in storage. So this section of the regulations is entitled Storage of Class 6 or 8 Substances at a Hazardous Substance Location. And so the inclusion of storage in that title has resulted in some policy clarifications from WorkSafe regarding what is required for storage and for areas that are not in storage. And this is what has caused the most debate and discussion and some confusion around the implementation of this parts of the regulations. And it continues to do so. We're always seeking clarification here. So this is WorkSafe's current position. They consider a substance to be in storage if it's in a container that's closed and is not connected to or supplying a process, if it's temporarily opened for decanting within the store, or if it's a stationary container that's not a process container. So if it's a tank, then it would be considered in storage. So if you're in storage, then you need to establish your hazardous substance location and get a location compliance certificate. On the other side of that, WorkSafe consider that a substance is not in storage if it's in a container that is supplying a process and that is either manually controlled or controlled by the process. So for example, you might have a dosing system that monitors the pH and then adds in a chemical to balance that as required. If it's a single container for use in a processing area, so you might have a 20-litre container or a drum of something that's there, that's used in that area, but it's not necessarily connected to something. Or if it's a process container, then it's not in storage, it's for use of something there. So in those circumstances, a hazardous substance location and location certificate is not required. There are still many grey areas around this, so if you're not sure where your situation fits, do give us a call. The other place you could keep your toxic and corrosives is at a transit depot. So if it's present for more than 24 hours or 2 hours for a tracked substance, then it needs to be either at a hazardous substance location or it can be held at a transit depot for up to 3 days. So a transit depot is a permanent place, so it's a designated area where you hold your substances unopened for up to 3 days. And at the transit depot, you need to notify WorkSafe that you're commissioning it, make sure all the containers remain closed, make sure that the substances are able to be secured if required, that you've got all your worker training undertaken and the records of that. There are provisions and distances for the separation of the trucks, road vehicles and containers that are not on trucks and how far apart they need to be from each other. You need to have an area set aside for damaged or spilled materials so that you can manage that. And also there are some requirements about stacking containers or stacking shipping containers there. So how much you can have in one place and making sure that your segregation is in place there. If we are storing it for more than 3 days, then we are at our hazardous substance location. So we've established that we are storing it, we're over our threshold. What do we need to manage for our hazardous substance location? So there are 2 places where you can store things. You can have a store that's not an indoor cabinet, or you can have them in an indoor cabinet. So a store or a place where you're keeping your substances that's not an indoor cabinet needs to have access for emergency services. So that should be, it should be located on the ground floor unless you've got approval from WorkSafe. The store needs to be secured. So aside from our requirement earlier for securing substances, the store needs to be secured so that only authorised people have access. And if it's a larger store, more than 25 square metres, then it needs to have 2 means of access. It needs to be constructed, if it's a new construction, of non-combustible materials and that are resistant to attack by the substances being stored. And if there's a ventilation hazard, then we need to make sure that there is adequate ventilation. So making sure that any concentration of dust, mist or vapour is as low as reasonably practicable, and if there is a prescribed exposure standard, then that's not being exceeded. We need to have spill containment measures. We need to make sure that they are away from heat, that the containers are closed, and that we store them in a way that's going to avoid spillage. And we need to make sure that our substances are kept away from things that are incompatible or react dangerously. Make sure that we're not causing, not prone to stack collapse with how we stack substances, and making sure that there is a safety shower, an eye wash and hand washing facilities available. But if they're stored in closed packages, then just hand washing facilities are required. These stores also require separation distances. This is probably the other major area of debate. So making sure that it's separated from protected and public places, depending on the class and quantity, whether they're open or closed or whether they're tanks. There are some provisions for retail premises and also for the intervening walls. There are a few problems with the regulations around the separation distances, and so there has been some consultation on minor amendments to the regulations, and these are expected early next year. So there's some distances and tables that need to be referred to that are getting fixed, and there's also going to be introduced the ability to reduce some of these separation distances with a risk assessment being done. So again, if you've got questions about your separation distances, do talk to us. If we're not in an indoor storage cabinet, then we probably are at an indoor storage cabinet, and so the requirements there again are around keeping our incompatibles apart. There are maximum quantities that are permitted in a cabinet, and the cabinets have to be to a particular design standard, so the Australian standards, for example. If you are ventilating your cabinets, make sure that they're discharging in a safe location and that the location's not impeding safe exit, that you've got somewhere to wash your hands, and that your cabinets are separated from each other, and they should also be marked and labelled. So indoor storage cabinets is a way for dealing with smaller quantities, but be aware there are some quantity limits as to what can actually be in a cabinet or a cluster of cabinets. You're going to need a location compliance certificate if you have your substances at a hazardous substance location. So it's a similar process to what you may be familiar with your flammable or oxidizing substances. But in the case of toxics and corrosives, that certificate can be issued for up to 3 years. So your certifier will be needing you to provide evidence that you've notified your location, that you have a certified handler or controlled substance license if necessary, you've got your worker training records, that it meets the requirements for our storage type, whether it's a cabinet or not, and our separation distances, that your incompatibles are being managed, that you've got a site plan, that your equipment meets those requirements for containing and dispensing in a controlled manner, and that you've got the documentation associated with that, and similarly that you're using PPE where required. Looking at your signage, your emergency plans, that you have those cleanup or spill equipment, materials and neutralisers, and that you've got your secondary containment. So those are what the certifier is looking at and certifying for your location certificate. Workplace have published recently, last month, a quick guide to certification for your locations holding toxic and corrosive substances. So that's on their website. So what are we going to do if we are not in storage or if we're using it? So there aren't specific regulations that cover this situation. So we'd look at the requirements in general that fall outside of that section on storage. And so if we do that, we find that we need to make sure we've got our equipment and materials for dealing with spills, that if it's a process container, then you'd need to comply with all the requirements in Part 17, that we've got secondary containment, we've got segregation from incompatibles, and we're dealing with our risk management. And where we're using substances, that is where there is the chance for more hazards or risk to be introduced. I'll shortly go and have a look and see if there were any questions on the Q&A, but to finish up, we have Most of the substances that you'll have will have at least some class 6 classifications. Not everything that's toxic will kill you, but the long-term quality of life impacts do need to be taken seriously, and even the irritants can make your life unpleasant for several days. There are still some matters of debate around cases of storage or not in storage, and we are waiting on regulatory correction around some of those separation distances and other things. And we've got the GHS coming next year as well, which we're all looking forward to see what that's going to, how that's going to affect a change. On that matter, with that change to the GHS coming in, the hazardous substance regulations are not going to be affected immediately. There's up to 5 years for the regulations to change in relation to the GHS. I've just got one question. Yes, the presentation will be available online. An email will be sent out after today with that information. If you do have any other questions, please do not hesitate to get in contact with our hazardous substances team. We've been taking a lot of the tricky areas, the grey areas, to WorkSafe for some clarification and getting confirmation in writing of our interpretations, which is always good to see. So thank you for your attention today. If you do have questions, contact us, and also have a look on our YouTube page there for the other webinars that we have done. Thank you.